The summer the aquifer dropped 6 feet in 8 weeks. Every well driller in the county was booked 3 months out, and the people of Harlan Township stood in their dooryards in the early mornings, listening for a sound that never came, which was the sound of water moving anywhere beneath them. That was the summer they remembered Vera Okafor. That was the summer they walked up her lane with their hats in their hands and their mouths shaped around words that tasted of ash, because asking was hard for people who had spent 2 years calling her the Goat Woman. And the Goat Woman was not a kindness the way they said it. She knew that. She had known it from the first Tuesday in October 2 years before, when she had sat in a folding chair in the back of the Harlan Township Municipal Hall and raised her paddle for the 47th time in a row and bought herself 47 acres of blackberry thicket and sumac scrub and 1 listing corn crib for $4,800, which was every dollar she had saved in 11 years of working for other people. She had told herself she was buying land, which was true. She had told herself she was buying a future, which she believed. What she did not know yet, because the land had not told her yet, was that she was buying the oldest active spring in the eastern half of the county, buried under 40 years of neglect, and a canopy so thick the sun hit the ground there like a rumor. The land knew. The land had been waiting. You could not rush it into telling. You only had to show up every morning and be still enough to hear it. The auctioneer that October had been a man named Doyle, and Doyle had the kind of cheerful indifference that comes from selling things nobody wants for the second or third time. He read the parcel number from his clipboard without looking up. He mentioned the back taxes owed, which were $1,900 accumulated over 6 years by an estate that had no heirs willing to claim the liability. He mentioned the acreage. He did not mention that it had last been farmed in the early 1982, or that the 7 shallow test wells bored on the property between 1987 and 2001 had all come up dry or brine sour, or that the county extension office had a file on those 47 acres that was practically a monument to failure. He did not mention those things because everyone in the room already knew them, which was why no one else had raised a paddle. There were 14 other people in the room. 6 of them were there to watch Doyle sell the salvageable equipment from the Mercer estate, which came later in the auction. The other 8 were there for reasons of their own that had nothing to do with the scrub parcel. When Vera raised her paddle for the opening bid, 2 men in the 3rd row turned around to look at her. One of them, whose name was Garrett Phipps and who ran the only operating grain elevator in 3 townships, said something to the other one that Vera could not hear across the echoing room, and both of them smiled. Doyle rapped his gavel with the sound of a judgment being made, though whose judgment and on whom it would fall would not be clear for another 2 years. She drove out to the property that same afternoon with the tax sale certificate folded in the breast pocket of her flannel shirt. The lane was 2 ruts through waist-high goldenrod, and she had to get out twice to move fallen branches before her truck could reach the crib. The corn crib was a hand-hewn post and rail structure, gaps between the boards wide enough to put a fist through, the roof line gone soft at the ridge, but the sill logs still solid where she kicked them. She walked the perimeter of the parcel in the last 2 hours of daylight, pushing through blackberry canes that raked her forearms and left thin red lines she would wear like a map of the land. The northwest corner rose into a stand of old-growth white oak that surprised her, because nothing in the county assessor's notes had mentioned old-growth anything. The trees were maybe 120 years old by the thickness of the trunks. Their canopy killed the undergrowth beneath them, and the ground there was a soft duff of decades of leaves, dark and cool and smelling of a different world than the scorched clay outside the fence line. She stood among them for a long time. She was 41 years old, and she had grown up in a city where you learned very young that land belonged to other people. She pressed the flat of her hand against the nearest oak and felt, or imagined she felt, a faint trembling that had nothing to do with wind. She told herself that was fancy. She told herself to go home and eat and get some sleep. She listened to herself for once and did both. In the morning she went back, which she would do every morning for the next 731 days, before the summer the wells went dry. She had planned to raise chickens. She had looked at the arithmetic of chickens carefully. Feed costs per bird, mortality rates in a first year, the price per dozen eggs at farmers' markets within a 40-minute drive, and she had built a small careful model on a notepad that said chickens were possible. Chickens were manageable. Chickens were a beginner's option for a woman, starting on raw land with $4,800 spent and her savings account reading a number that induced a specific cold clarity in the back of the throat. What changed the arithmetic was a Tuesday in late November when she drove to the Harlan Farm Supply to price chicken wire and found, penned in a stock trailer in the parking lot, 22 boar crosses and one enormous La Mancha doe. Someone was selling out of an estate. A card on the trailer said, "Make offer." She did not make an offer immediately. She stood at the fence of the trailer for 40 minutes in the cold and watched the animals. They were thin from neglect, but not broken. They had a calm about them. She recognized as different from resignation. The doe, who was cream-colored and ancient and entirely earless in the fashion of her breed, watched Vera back with an expression of settled patience that Vera later described. To the one person she told about it as the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific person to arrive and has finally stopped being surprised by how long it takes. Vera bought all 23 animals for $1,100, which she negotiated down from $1,400 because 3 of the boar crosses needed veterinary attention. She factored into her counteroffer. She drove home with 23 goats in a borrowed trailer, and the chicken arithmetic on her notepad now obsolete, replaced by a new arithmetic that she would run again every week for the next several months, penciling in and erasing and penciling in again, trying to find the seam between surviving and failing. The community's verdict arrived in installments. There was the feed store where silence fell in a particular way when she came in, and men who had been talking with ease about very little went quiet, and then resumed at a slightly different pitch, not hostile, exactly, but recalibrated, the way a room sounds when it has decided what it thinks of you. There was the remark from Garrett Phipps at the post office in February, delivered with his back half turned so it could be mistaken for casual, about how goats on scrub ground were a hobby for people who did not have to make money. There was the woman at the hardware store who asked, with genuine sympathy that made it somehow worse, whether Vera had anyone helping her, anyone at all. And when Vera said no, the woman made a small sound that was not quite a word. There were the teenagers who drove slowly past her gate on weekend evenings, and sometimes leaned out of car windows to make the sound that people make when they are imitating goats, and believed this to be devastating wit. Through all of this, Vera said very little. She had learned in 11 years of working for other people that being right is its own kind of reply, provided you are patient enough to let the reply come at its own pace, which could be a long pace, longer than pride easily tolerates, long enough to require a specific kind of stubbornness that is not the same as anger, even though it lives in the same neighborhood. It was in February, 4 months after the purchase, that Clarence Woniak appeared at her fence line. He was 83 years old, and he farmed the 60-acre parcel that shared her western boundary, a place he had worked for 51 years since coming from Silesia with his wife, who had been dead for a decade, but whose opinion he still cited on agricultural matters as if she were in the next room and would come to the door if called. He arrived on foot with a jar of something in each hand, cherry preserves and what turned out to be a fermented beet preparation he recommended. For the immune systems of animals under stress, a claim Vera received with polite skepticism and quietly researched afterward and found had more support in old European livestock literature than she had expected. He had watched her working the land for 4 months, he said, from his upper pasture. He had not come sooner because he wanted to see if she was serious before he spent the walk. He had concluded she was serious. He leaned on her fence and looked at the goats in the half-cleared east corner, and he said, in the accented English he had been speaking for 50 years and had never felt the need to smooth out, "The land here is like a very old letter written in a language you do not speak yet. You do not force a translation. You wait, and you learn one word at a time, and the letter tells you what it says when it is ready and not before." Vera looked at him for a moment, and then said, "How long does it take?" Clarence said he did not know exactly, but that in his experience, the land began to say something useful in the second or third year, provided you had been listening since the first day, and not just since you got impatient. He looked at the old-growth oak corner. He said, "I know those trees. They were old when my father-in-law first told me about this land. He said the ground under them never dries. Not in any summer he ever knew." She looked at the oak corner. She looked back at Clarence. He had already turned to go. He said over his shoulder, "Let the animals tell you where they want to go next. They know the land before you do. That is the advantage they have over a plan." She began the practice of following the goat's preference rather than her own. This was not as easy as it sounds, because her instinct was to clear systematically, working in logical parallel strips from the lane inward, making visible progress that could be measured and felt as control over the situation. The goats had no interest in parallel strips. They moved according to some calculus she could not read at first, favoring certain areas over others, returning to the northwest corner again and again when they had their free choice of the whole 47 acres. She watched them do this for 3 weeks before she began to follow them there in the mornings to see what they were after. The ground in the northwest corner, in the understory at the edge of the oak stand, was different from the ground elsewhere. It was softer, darker, and in the morning it held a coolness that lifted off it like breath. The goats were not after forage there, or not only forage. They were after the ground itself, pressing their noses into the dark duff in a specific place 10 feet east of the largest oak, a place no wider than a kitchen table. The doe, the old La Mancha Vera had named Patience because it was the only name that fit her, stood in that spot more than any other animal, and closed her eyes in a way that was not sleep, but something older than sleep. In the 3rd week of March, on a morning cold enough that the breath of 23 goats hung in the air like small clouds, Vera dug into that spot with a post-hole digger on a pure instinct she could not have justified to anyone, and struck water at 31 inches. Nada well. Nada. Bore. A spring seeping laterally through a clay lens, ancient and quiet, and flowing at a rate she measured initially at roughly 4 gallons per minute. And that proved, over the following weeks, to be consistent regardless of rainfall. She stood in the hole she had dug and looked at her hands, which were wet. And she thought of Clarence saying the land begins to say something useful in the 2nd or 3rd year. And then she thought, I have been here 5 months. Either she had listened better than most, or the land had been more eager than most to be heard. She did not know which. She covered the spot back over, carefully rebuilt the duff, and told no one. She had the specific sensation of a person who has been given something they had not earned yet and must now earn backward, which required not spending the gift before the work was done. The child arrived in April. His name was Marcus, and he was 9 years old, and he belonged to the family that rented the small house at the end of her lane, a family that had recently come down in the world in the specific, quiet way that involves a father's layoff and a mother's double shifts, and a general restructuring of what is considered essential. Marcus appeared at her fence one Saturday morning, in the manner of a child who has decided on something but is executing the decision with elaborate casualness, as if he had simply found himself there by accident and was mildly interested in the goats and had no particular plan. She gave him a pail and showed him which goats would drink from a held pail and which would rather work for it. He was there the next Saturday and the one after. By May he was there on school days in the hour before the bus came, and she had worked out with his mother, a woman of remarkable efficiency and very few spare words, that this was acceptable to all parties. Marcus named every goat within 6 weeks. He named them after planets and moons, and in one case a theorem he had recently encountered, so that she found herself calling Patience's 2 spring kids Callisto and Io, and the most troublesome of the Boer crosses, a young buck of dramatic opinions, she heard Marcus address as Pythagoras, which she felt was either a very poor choice or an extremely accurate one. He never asked why she went to the northwest corner with the post-hole digger and then covered it back over. He watched her do it. He watched her come back to that spot and kneel and press her palm to the duff, the way you might check a sleeping child's forehead. He said nothing. She understood that he understood more than he said, which was one of the things about him that reminded her of the doe patients, who also understood more than she said, being a goat and therefore having the advantage of never being tempted to fill silence with noise. By the following October, she had cleared 28 of the 47 acres. The blackberry canes were gone from everything except a deliberate quarter-acre she kept at the south fence because the canes were producing and the goats were not allowed near them. Only her, in the late summer, with a bucket. The sumac was gone. The old corn crib had a new roof, hand-split cedar shingles. She had laid herself on 3 consecutive weekends, and it functioned now as a dry storage barn of surprising adequacy. She had constructed a rainwater catchment from the roof into 2 500-gallon polyethylene tanks, which she connected with a gravity feed line to the watering stations she had built at 3 points in the cleared pasture. And beneath the northwest corner, accessed through a lined and cased shaft, she had dug and set herself with rented equipment over 2 weekends in July. The spring flowed at its steady 4 gallons per minute into a covered cistern of 800 gallons capacity, fed from there by a hand pump she had installed with the help of Clarence, who had contributed both advice and a set of pump fittings he had kept in his barn since 1987 because he said his wife had told him to keep them because you never knew, and she had been correct, as she generally was. The cistern was full in 12 hours and stayed full. The arithmetic had changed so completely from the first notepad model that she sometimes took out the old notepad and looked at it the way you might look at a photograph of yourself from a time before you knew what you know. The old model had estimated survival as contingent on a great many variables that had since resolved in her favor. The new model was considerably shorter. It said, 31 acres cleared by next spring. 23 goats become 40 with the spring kidding. 8 farmers markets within range. Soap and cheese as value-added lines, and the spring. It said the spring last of all, and she had drawn a box around it, and inside the box she had written the word later, which was her name for the thing she was saving until she knew exactly what saving it was worth. The outside validation arrived not from a farmer's market, but from a woman named Deirdre Solis, who drove a refrigerated panel truck with a Chicago wholesale license and who stopped at Vera's roadside sign, which said nothing except fresh goat milk and a phone number, on a Wednesday in June, 14 months after the purchase. Deirdre Solis had been buying for an artisanal cheese operation that had recently lost its rural Illinois supplier and was driving a wide loop through the region on the logic that good milk hides. She tasted the milk warm from that morning's milking, standing in Vera's barn, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said it was the cleanest milk she had tasted from a boar cross operation in 15 years, and she wanted to know what Vera was running them on. Vera said cleared scrubland, native browse, and spring water. Deirdre Solis looked at the animals. She looked at the cleared pasture. She looked at Vera. She offered 38 cents per pound above the regional market rate for a standing weekly contract, which Vera signed on the hood of the refrigerated truck with a pen Deirdre Solis produced from her shirt pocket as if she had been expecting the signing to happen exactly here. That contract was worth over the first year nearly $12,000 above what Vera would have received selling at market, and it was the first number she put into the new model that did not require the word contingent anywhere near it. She did not tell anyone in Harlan Township about the contract. She drove to Clarence's farm that evening and told him, because he had earned the information, and he sat with it for a moment and then said, "The land began to speak earlier than I predicted." She said she thought she had helped it along a little. He said that was also what the letter says. If you have learned enough of the language. He poured 2 small glasses of a plum spirit he produced from a cabinet that appeared to contain nothing but plum spirit, and they drank without a toast, because none was needed. Garrett Phipps had been watching. She knew this later with a precision that came from a specific error he made, but she suspected it in a general way from the autumn of the first year onward, when his manner toward her shifted from amused dismissal to something with more attention in it. Phipps ran the grain elevator, and he also sat on the board of a land consolidation consortium that operated under a name suggesting civic improvement and pursued the actual business of assembling distressed parcels for resale to large-format agricultural operations. He had twice offered to buy her parcel in the first year, the first time at $6,000, which he framed as generous given the land's history, and the second time at $9,500, which he framed as the absolute ceiling of any rational valuation and possibly above it. She declined both offers in single sentences. His third approach came in the spring of the second year, not as a purchase offer but as a partnership proposal, which was a different shape of the same intention, and she declined it also, in the same number of words she used for the others, because the number of words she used for a refusal was not determined by how the asking was dressed. After the third refusal, his manner completed its shift from attention to a careful warmth that she understood as the warmth of a person who has decided to be patient because they believe patience will be rewarded. She was familiar with the strategic patience of people who believe that a woman alone cannot hold what a woman alone has built. She had been familiar with it for 41 years. It was one of the less interesting things she was familiar with. When the summer came that the aquifer dropped 6 feet in 8 weeks, it came, like Clarence had once described, a drought he remembered from childhood, arriving like someone had opened a door in the sky, and behind the door was a furnace, and the door did not close again for 11 weeks. The wells in Harlan Township began failing in the 5th week. The shallow wells went first, the hand-dug ones, and the old drilled wells under 100 feet, and then the medium wells began to cough and slow. By the 7th week, 14 of the 22 working farms in the township were hauling water from the county facility in Meridian, 26 miles south, at a cost that Vera heard described at the feed store as ruinous, which was not an exaggeration. The conventional grain and soybean operations, dependent on irrigation from a shared aquifer that was now visibly failing, were watching their crop show the specific posture of a plant that is given up on the current season and is deciding whether to survive to the next one. It was during the 7th week that the first of her neighbors came up her lane. He was a man named Russell Hagg, who had led the laughter at the municipal hall the October she bought the parcel, a big prosperous man who ran 600 acres of corn and soybeans, and who had at various points described her goats as a petting zoo, her methods as charming, and her business as something his wife could probably replicate in an afternoon. He came up her lane in the 7th week of the drought, without his truck, on foot, in the morning heat, and he stood at her gate and took off his cap and held it in both hands, which was a gesture that cost him considerably, and she could see it costing him. He said he had heard she had water. She said she had a spring. He said he had 90 acres of corn that were going to be total losses within 2 weeks without water, and he said he knew he had not always. And then he stopped and started again, and said he was asking for help, and he understood if she said no. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Come in, and I'll show you what I have." The arithmetic of that moment was the most important arithmetic she had ever done, and it was not about money. What happened at the Harlan Township emergency water meeting in the 8th week of the drought was not originally her idea. The meeting was called by the county commissioner at the request of the agricultural producers, which meant, in practice, at the request of Garrett Phipps, who had arrived at the meeting with a printed proposal in a folder that he distributed with the help of 2 men in clean shirts who were not from the township. The proposal described a temporary water access cooperative. It noted the existence of a private spring source in the township. It proposed a per-gallon fee structure for access to that source under emergency provisions, administered by the consortium, with a management fee to be retained by the consortium for the duration of the emergency period. The fee structure worked out to roughly 3 times what the county facility in Meridian charged per gallon including transport. Vera sat in the 3rd row and read the proposal twice. Then she looked at the figure cited for the estimated yield of the spring, which was listed in the proposal as 5.2 gallons per minute. Her yield had never been public knowledge. She had measured it herself and recorded it in a personal notebook, and told one person, who was Clarence, and Clarence had told no one. The figure in Phipps's proposal was incorrect by 1/10 of a gallon per minute, which was the kind of error you make when you are estimating from observation rather than measurement, when you have been standing at a fence line or at the edge of a wood with a view of someone else's cistern and a stopwatch and your own arithmetic rather than the owner's, and the figure was precise enough that it could not have been arrived at by guesswork. She folded the proposal and put it in her pocket. When Phipps finished his presentation, she raised her hand, and she stood up and she said she had a question about the yield figure. She said the figure in the proposal was specific, and she wondered where it came from since the spring was on private land and the yield had not been published anywhere. She watched Phipps's face make a small journey through several rooms before it arrived at a composed expression that had arrived a half-second too late. He said the figure was an engineering estimate. She said she would like to know the name of the engineer. He said the details were available on request. She said she was requesting them now, in the meeting, in front of the other people who were being asked to enter into a financial arrangement based on those figures. The room was quiet. Russell Hagg, who was sitting 2 rows ahead of her, turned around in his chair and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. She said, "The actual yield is 4 gallons per minute, which I know because I measured it myself and recorded it, and the yield in this proposal is a different number, which tells me something about how this proposal was researched." Then she said she had a counter-proposal, which was simpler. She said the spring was hers. The water was hers. She was willing to make it available to every working farm in the township for the duration of the emergency, at a rate of $2 per 100 gallons, payable not to her in money, but in a single hour of labor per farm, per week, directed at the ongoing restoration of her land. Because the clearing work still had 19 acres outstanding, and she could use the hands. She said the rate of $2 per 100 gallons would cover her actual costs. She said she was not interested in profit from her neighbors. Difficulty, she said she was interested in her neighbors. She sat down. The room made a sound that was not applause and was not speech, but was something between them, the sound of a judgment reversing itself. Phipps stood up and began to speak, and 3 people in the room told him to sit down, which he did. And then he stood up again and said something about property rights and market mechanisms and left the building in the manner of a man who has confused dignity with velocity. The 2 men in clean shirts followed him. The county commissioner, a practical woman who had been watching all of this with the careful attention of someone reading a rapidly changing document, called a vote on Vera's proposal, and it carried by a show of hands that left perhaps 2 abstentions, both of whom raised their hands a moment later when they saw what everyone else was doing. Clarence, who had come to the meeting and sat in the back without saying anything, raised his hand among the others. Vera saw him from across the room, and he made no expression at all, which was his way of expressing something considerable. The water ran to 31 of the township's farms over the following 3 weeks through a gravity-fed distribution line that the farmers built themselves in 2 days of combined labor, a project that had the atmosphere of a barn raising from an era before collective effort became something that required a consultant. Marcus came with his father, who had been rehired in May and who turned out to be a skilled hand with PVC and a man of few words and efficient movement. And Marcus walked the line from the cistern to the first distribution point and back again 3 times to inspect it, which was more than adequate. And Vera noticed that he called the doe Patience by her name when he passed her in the pasture, and Patience acknowledged this with her settled, earless calm, and Vera thought that the land was doing what Clarence had said it would do, which was say something useful, and that the something useful it was saying at that moment was that she was no longer alone on it. The rains returned in the 3rd week of September, slow at first, and then generous. The kind of rain that means business and knows it. She stood in the open door of the corn crib and watched it come across the northwest corner, bending the high grass she had planted in the cleared ground in a long, slow wave. And the oak trees received it with a sound like breathing that has been held a long time and can finally be released. The spring did not slow or quicken with the rain, which was its nature. A consistency that had nothing to do with the surface weather and everything to do with the deep, slow hydrology of the claylands through which it moved. A system of 1,000 years' duration that had not been interrupted by 40 years of neglect, or 6 feet of dropped aquifer, or any of the difficulties of the particular summer, because a system that has been working for 1,000 years has survived many particular summers and remembers them all and whispers about none of them to anyone who has not been still enough to listen. She had been still enough. She had needed help to learn to be still enough. A jar of cherry preserves and an old Silesian man and an earless doe and a child who named things after moons. She was 43 years old, and she owned 47 acres and a corn crib with a good roof and a spring that would outlast her and a contract for milk that was renewed in August at 41 cents per pound, above market, and 47 goats, because the spring kidding had added 24 kids, which was a ratio she was satisfied with. The arithmetic of survival had become the arithmetic of something else, something she did not have a name for, that was nevertheless a number she could feel in the specific weight of the land under her boots in the morning. Clarence came in the first week of October, a year and a week after the meeting in the township hall. He brought cherry preserves and the fermented beet preparation and a third jar she did not recognize. He said it was his wife's recipe for a pear spirit, and that his wife had said in whatever room she occupied now that the occasion called for it. Vera looked at him. He said, "You listened faster than I thought you would." She said, she'd had good teachers. He said, "The land taught you. The land is the teacher. I only told you to be quiet long enough to hear it." He looked at the northwest corner, where the oaks stood in the October light, doing what old oaks do in October light, which is radiate a quality of permanence that makes human tenure feel brief, and human worry feel like a small weather passing through a large silence. He said, "My wife always said, the best kind of belonging is the kind you did not purchase, but grew." Vera thought about this. She had purchased 47 acres, which was true and exact. $4,800. Every dollar she had. But what she had grown on those 47 acres was something the receipt did not cover, something that had no line in the tax sale certificate and no entry in any ledger she kept, which was the right to stand on that ground in October light among the oak trees and the goats and the good smell of rain-wet grass, and feel that the ground stood under her the way ground stands under something it has decided belongs to it, which is to say, without reservation, without condition, and with the full patience of a system that has been working for 1,000 years and has 1,000 more to go. She opened the pear spirit. Marcus appeared at the fence line in the manner of a child who has been hoping there might be something to observe, and is performing the casualness of someone who is just passing. She waved him over. Patience stood in the northwest corner, in the thin October sun, her eyes half closed in the expression of settled waiting that Vera now understood was not waiting at all, but simply the face of a creature who has always known where it belongs, and has never found this remarkable. The rye she had overseeded in the cleared acres was coming up green from the rain in long orderly rows, and the corn crib stood solid under its new cedar roof. And the lane was passable now with gravel she had laid one load at a time across the summer, and nowhere on the 47 acres was there a blackberry cane that had not been deliberately kept. And the ones that had been kept were already putting up the red canes that meant next year's fruit, which she was already planning to turn into something and sell, because that is the arithmetic of a place that has become a place, which is that it is always already planning next year's fruit and seeing the shape of it in this year's cane, without having to say, so that it will be there to see it come.